blood soaked into Mississippi clay, while 12 sets of footprints disappeared into morning fog. The hunting party's horses stood riderless, their saddles empty as shallow graves. This is the story of how one woman turned the machinery of oppression against itself, leading the largest successful escape in Mississippi history, while leaving behind evidence that would haunt Vicksburg for generations. The Yazoo River bent like a serpent's spine around Vicksburg's bluffs on that humid morning of August 15, 1847. Steamboat whistles echoed across muddy water thick as molasses, while Spanish moss whispered secrets between cypress branches, heavy with summer rain. The air tasted of river silt and pending thunder, thick enough to choke on hope or despair in equal measure. Sarah crouched in the pre-dawn darkness of the Merriweather plantation kitchen, her calloused hands steady as she counted supplies one final time. 12 canvas sacks lay before her, each containing 3 days of cornbread, dried meat, and precious salt. Her fingers traced the outline of a knife hidden beneath flour sacks, its blade honed sharp enough to split conscience from necessity. She had been planning this moment for 3 years. The Merriweather estate sprawled across 4,000 acres of cotton fields east of Vicksburg, where Judge Hamilton Merriweather ruled over 87 enslaved souls with the methodical cruelty of a man who considered human bondage a divine blessing. Sarah had been his property for 11 years, purchased at a New Orleans auction after her previous owner died owing debts. The bill of sale listed her value at $900, noting her skills in cooking, midwifery, and what the auctioneer called exceptional intelligence for her kind. That intelligence would prove more dangerous than any weapon. From the Vicksburg Evening Post, August 10, 1847. Judge Merriweather announces expanded patrols following recent disturbances. Any person harboring runaways faces maximum penalty under law. The runaways Sarah planned to lead weren't random selections born of desperation. Each had been carefully chosen over months of whispered conversations and coded songs hummed while picking cotton. There was Moses, the blacksmith whose 3 children had been sold to Alabama plantations. Ruth, barely 16, who faced daily assault from the overseer's son. Samuel, who could track game through swamp country like reading scripture. Each carried skills that would mean survival or death in the wilderness ahead. But Sarah carried something more valuable than survival skills. She carried a map drawn in her memory from conversations with riverboat crews, traced from stories whispered by Underground Railroad conductors, memorized from the careful observations of a woman who understood that knowledge was the only currency that couldn't be stolen. The route would take them north through the Yazoo Delta, across hostile territory where professional slave catchers earned bounties that exceeded most men's annual wages. The kitchen door creaked on leather hinges as Sarah's chosen 12 slipped inside one by one, shadows moving with the practiced silence of people whose lives depended on invisibility. No words were spoken. Plans had been rehearsed through glances and gestures, communicated in the language of the perpetually watched. Outside, the plantation bell would ring in 2 hours, summoning them to another day of unpaid labor. By then, they intended to be ghosts. But Judge Merriweather had not built his fortune through negligence. His network of informants extended into every cabin, every field, every whispered prayer. And tonight, that network had detected something unusual in the quarters. Conversations that stopped too quickly when overseers approached, supplies missing from storerooms, the kind of restless energy that preceded either rebellion or escape. The hunting party was already saddling their horses. Death walks on silent feet. Sarah pressed her ear against the kitchen's back door, listening for sounds that shouldn't exist in the pre-dawn quiet. What she heard instead was the distant jingle of spurs, the creak of leather, the low murmur of white voices planning violence with the casual efficiency of men who had hunted human beings before. Before we dive deeper into this night that would reshape everything, I want to know where you're watching from right now. What time is it where you are? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if stories like this fascinate you, hit that like button and subscribe. Because what you're about to hear has been buried in courthouse records for over a century. The 12 runaways would have exactly one advantage that the hunting party couldn't anticipate. Sarah hadn't just planned an escape, she had planned a war. Gunpowder and torch smoke mingled with the sweet stench of fear sweat as 6 white men loaded their weapons by lamplight. Judge Merriweather's voice cut through the stable yard like a cleaver through bone. Sarah's escape would either succeed in the next few hours or end with 12 bodies swaying from cypress branches, a warning that would echo across every plantation in Warren County. The hunting party assembled in the pre-dawn gloom of Merriweather's stable, their faces illuminated by the hellish glow of pine-pitch torches. The air reeked of leather oil and horse sweat, while saddle buckles clinked with the metallic rhythm of preparation for violence. Rough-hewn wooden beams overhead seemed to press down like coffin lids, trapping the scent of hay and human malice in equal measure. Judge Hamilton Merriweather stood 6 feet tall in his riding boots, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the early hour. At 53, he had built his fortune on cotton and human flesh, calculating the value of both with the cold precision of a man who viewed suffering as simply the cost of business. His pale blue eyes held the flat indifference of someone who had ordered beatings over breakfast and executions over evening whiskey. "They have perhaps 2 hours head start," Merriweather told his assembled hunters, consulting a gold pocket watch that had belonged to his grandfather. But runaways move slowly in groups, especially with women and children slowing them down. The hunters nodded with the confidence of men who had pursued human prey before. There was Overseer James Patterson, whose scarred knuckles told stories of casual brutality. Deputy Sheriff William Crenshaw, who supplemented his government salary with bounty hunting. Brothers Tom and Frank Hutchins, professional slave catchers whose reputation extended from New Orleans to Memphis. And Dr. Marcus Webb, whose medical knowledge made him useful for keeping captured runaways alive long enough to face punishment. Each man carried a rifle, pistols, rope, and iron shackles. From the Warren County Sheriff's Log, August 15, 1847. Authorized pursuit of stolen property. Shoot to wound, not kill. Dead slaves yield no profit. What the hunting party didn't know was that Sarah had been studying them for 3 years, learning their habits with the methodical patience of someone who understood that knowledge of the enemy was the difference between freedom and death. She knew Patterson drank heavily and stumbled in darkness. She knew Crenshaw's horse threw him when startled by gunfire. She knew the Hutchins brothers always split up to cover more ground, making them vulnerable to ambush. Most importantly, she knew they expected terrified runaways running blindly through unfamiliar territory. They would find something else entirely. While the hunters prepared their weapons, Sarah was conducting her own briefing in the kitchen cellar, speaking in whispers that barely disturbed the humid air. The 12 escapees crouched in a circle, their faces masks of determination carved from desperation. Moonlight filtering through the cellar's single window cast prison bar shadows across their planning session. "The first rule," Sarah said, her voice steady as granite, "is that we don't run, we hunt." Moses, the blacksmith, hefted a hammer he'd smuggled from his forge. At 45, he had buried 3 children sold away from him, and carried their memory like shrapnel in his chest. "How do we fight men with guns?" Sarah smiled, but her expression held no warmth. "The same way mice fight cats. We use the darkness, the terrain, and their own assumptions against them. They expect us to scatter like frightened animals. Instead, we move as one unit, with one purpose." She spread a hand-drawn map across the dirt floor, its lines traced in charcoal and memory. "The route they'll expect takes us northeast toward the Yazoo, but we're going northwest first, toward the old Henderson place. Abandoned since the fever took the family 5 years ago. The hunting party will follow obvious tracks toward the river while we circle, behind them." Ruth, barely 16 but aged beyond her years by trauma, studied the map with fierce attention. "What about the dogs?" "Dogs follow scent," Sarah replied, "but not through running water and not through substances that mask human smell." She produced a small cloth bundle containing wild onions, fox urine collected over weeks, and other pungent materials that would confuse even the most experienced tracking hounds. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Vengeance wears many faces. Samuel, the tracker, understood immediately. "We become the hunters instead of the hunted, use their own methods against them." Sarah nodded. "Patterson always scouts ahead alone when they're close to prey. The Hutchins brothers split up to cover more ground. Crenshaw stays with the horses. Webb hangs back to avoid danger. Merriweather positions himself where he can observe without risk." She paused, letting the implications settle. "Divide them, and they become vulnerable." But Sarah's plan required something the hunting party would never expect from escaped slaves: tactical coordination, advanced preparation, and the willingness to meet violence with violence. The cellar fell silent as each person absorbed what she was truly proposing. Outside, dawn was breaking gray and humid over the Mississippi Delta. The hunting party was mounting their horses, confident in their superior numbers, weapons, and experience. They had tracked down hundreds of runaways over the years, returning them to bondage or worse. None had ever fought back with military precision. The horses' hooves clattered against cobblestones as 6 riders departed the Merriweather estate, following what they believed would be obvious tracks leading toward the river. But Sarah had spent 3 years studying the abandoned Henderson plantation, mapping every hidden path, every defensive position, every advantage the terrain might offer. What would you do faced with the choice between certain death as a runaway and possible death as a fighter? How far would you go to taste freedom, even if that taste came seasoned with blood? The hunting party rode confidently into the Mississippi dawn, unaware they were about to become the hunted. Hoofbeats thundered across wet earth, while 12 shadows positioned themselves among rotting timbers like wolves preparing an ambush. The morning mist carried the scent of death and opportunity in equal measure. Sarah's gamble would either prove that enslaved people could outthink their oppressors, or it would end with her body feeding Mississippi ravens before sunset. The abandoned Henderson plantation squatted in the pre-dawn gloom like a broken promise, its once grand manor house reduced to a skeleton of charred beams and collapsed porches. Morning fog rolled between standing chimneys that pointed accusingly at gray skies, while the air hung thick with the smell of rotting wood, stagnant water, and the lingering ghosts of yellow fever that had claimed the Henderson family 5 years earlier. Weeds grew waist-high through what had once been manicured gardens, creating perfect cover for those who knew how to use shadows as weapons. Sarah had chosen this location with surgical precision. The plantation's layout offered multiple defensive positions, escape routes through the swampland beyond, and most importantly, a reputation that kept superstitious locals away. White folk avoided the Henderson place, claiming it was cursed by the spirits of fever victims. Sarah understood that fear could be as useful as any weapon when properly deployed. At 6:37 that morning, the hunting party discovered the first sign that their quarry was not behaving as expected. Deputy Sheriff Crenshaw dismounted beside what should have been clear tracks leading toward the Yazoo River. Instead, he found deliberately obscured footprints, broken branches arranged to suggest passage in multiple directions, and the kind of tactical misdirection that suggested military thinking rather than panicked flight. "Something's wrong here," Crenshaw called to Judge Merriweather, his voice carrying across the humid air. "These tracks have been doctored. Someone's trying to confuse our direction." Merriweather spurred his horse closer, studying the ground with the practiced eye of a man who had hunted human beings for profit. The morning light revealed footprints that seemed to lead in 3 different directions. Some pressed deep into soft earth, others barely visible on harder ground. Broken twigs pointed northeast toward the river, but also northwest toward the abandoned Henderson place, and due north toward the Yazoo Delta proper. "Clever," Merriweather admitted, his pale eyes narrowing. "But cleverness won't save them from dogs and determination." From Overseer Patterson's personal journal, August 15th, 1847. "The Negroes show unusual coordination. Someone is directing their movements with intelligence that exceeds normal capacity. Recommend extreme caution." What the hunting party failed to recognize was that the confusing tracks were not evidence of panic, but proof of preparation. Sarah had spent 3 years studying military tactics through conversations with Union soldiers passing through Vicksburg. Learning strategy from men who discussed war over dinners, she served in silence. She understood that successful warfare required turning enemy strengths into weaknesses. The hunter's confidence would become their vulnerability. While Merriweather's party debated which trail to follow, Sarah's 12 were already in position among the Henderson ruins, each person stationed according to skills that could mean the difference between freedom and death. Moses crouched behind the collapsed kitchen chimney, his blacksmith's hammer within easy reach. Ruth had climbed into the skeletal remains of the manor's second floor, where missing floorboards created perfect shooting positions for the hunting bow she'd crafted from hickory wood. Samuel used his tracking expertise to position the others where they could maximize surprise while minimizing exposure. But Sarah positioned herself in the most dangerous location of all. She stood in the open doorway of the Henderson Manor's front entrance, clearly visible to anyone approaching from the south. This apparent exposure was calculated bait, designed to draw the hunting party into a killing ground where superior numbers meant nothing and tactical position meant everything. The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the protective mist and exposing the ruined plantation in harsh daylight. Spanish moss draped the remaining oak trees like funeral shrouds, while mockingbirds called from branches heavy with humidity and impending violence. At 7:45, the hunting party made their decision. Death comes calling at dawn. "The tracks toward Henderson's place are the freshest," Tom Hutchins announced, his professional slave catcher's eye reading sign that others missed. "They're trying to throw us off by splitting trails, but the deepest impressions lead northwest." Judge Merriweather nodded, calculating risk versus reward with the cold precision that had built his fortune. "Patterson, you scout ahead. The rest of us will follow at a distance. If they're hiding in those ruins, we'll flush them out like quail." But Sarah had anticipated exactly this approach. Patterson's habit of scouting alone, the hunting party's tendency to spread out when approaching a target, their confidence in superior firepower over tactical thinking. Every weakness she had observed over 3 years of careful study was about to be tested in the crucible of actual combat. The abandoned plantation waited in mourning stillness, its broken walls and collapsed structures hiding 12 people who had transformed from property into predators. Sarah's plan required perfect timing, absolute discipline, and the willingness to kill rather than return to bondage. As Patterson rode his horse toward the Henderson ruins, unaware that 12 pairs of eyes tracked his every movement, Sarah faced the moment that would define everything. Success meant possible freedom for her people. Failure meant death for all of them, probably after torture designed to extract information about other potential escapes. The morning air carried the sound of approaching hoofbeats, growing louder with each passing second. In the ruins, 12 hearts beat with the rhythm of revolution. What price would you pay for the chance to transform from victim into victor? How far into darkness would you travel if it meant walking into light? Patterson reached the edge of the Henderson property, his rifle ready, his confidence about to meet Sarah's carefully prepared reality. Patterson's horse reared as an arrow whispered past his ear, its fletching still trembling in the oak bark behind him. The overseer's confident smile died on his lips as he realized the hunted had become hunters. The next 60 seconds would determine whether Sarah's 3 years of planning had created liberation or merely delayed execution for 12 souls who dared to fight back. The morning air exploded into chaos as Patterson's mount bucked wildly, throwing him hard against the collapsed stone foundation of the Henderson Manor's front steps. His rifle scattered across broken bricks while his horse bolted toward the tree line, stirrups bouncing like hanged men in the humid breeze. The smell of fierce sweat and crushed mint leaves filled the air where Patterson lay stunned, his expensive riding coat torn open to reveal the soft belly of a man who had grown comfortable with cruelty from a distance. Sarah stepped from the manor's shadowed doorway like vengeance given human form. She held a second arrow nocked to her bowstring, its iron point aimed directly at Patterson's chest. Her hands remained steady despite 3 years of suppressed rage threatening to overwhelm tactical discipline. Behind her, the ruins concealed 11 other escapees positioned with military precision, each one ready to transform from property into predator. "Mr. Patterson," Sarah said, her voice carrying the flat authority of someone who had moved beyond fear into something far more dangerous. "You've been hunting the wrong prey." Patterson scrambled backward across the broken stones, his pale face flushed with the sudden understanding that his assumptions about enslaved people's capabilities had been catastrophically wrong. Blood trickled from a gash on his forehead where he'd struck the foundation, but his eyes remained focused on the arrow point that tracked his every movement. "You can't escape," he gasped, reaching slowly toward a pistol at his belt. "The others are coming. They'll hear the commotion." Sarah's smile held no warmth. "We're counting on it." From the Vicksburg Evening Post, August 16th, 1847. Overseer James Patterson found bound and gagged at Henderson ruins. Claims attacked by organized group of runaways. Authorities investigating reports of tactical coordination. The sound of Patterson's horse crashing through underbrush had indeed alerted the hunting party, exactly as Sarah had planned. Judge Merriweather and the remaining 4 men spurred their mounts toward the Henderson plantation, expecting to find their scout pursuing scattered fugitives. Instead, they rode directly into a carefully prepared killing ground, where every advantage of terrain, surprise, and desperation had been weaponized against them. But Sarah's plan required more than tactical superiority. She needed to capture rather than kill, to gather intelligence rather than simply eliminate threats. Dead men told no stories. But terrified men could be convinced to spread very specific tales about what happened when enslaved people decided to fight back with organization and intelligence. "Moses," Sarah called softly, never taking her eyes off Patterson. "Secure our guest." Blacksmith emerged from behind the collapsed chimney, his hammer replaced by coils of rope that had once bound cotton bales. Within minutes, Patterson found himself trussed like livestock, his own methods of restraint turned against him with poetic precision. The approaching hoofbeats grew louder. Blood calls to blood. Ruth descended from her perch in the manor's skeletal upper floor, her homemade bow still strung and ready. At 16, she had learned to move through shadows like smoke, her small frame allowing access to positions that larger people couldn't reach. "5 riders approaching from the south," she reported. "Merriweather's in the lead, but they're spread out. The Hutchins brothers are flanking east and west." Sarah nodded, her mind calculating angles and timing with the precision of a military engineer. "Samuel, take 3 people and circle behind the eastern approach. When they dismount to investigate, they'll be vulnerable. Moses, you and 2 others cover the western flank. Ruth, maintain overwatch from above." The escaped slaves moved with coordinated efficiency that would have impressed Union Army officers, their positioning designed to create crossfire zones where superior numbers meant nothing and tactical advantage meant everything. Each person understood their role in a plan that transformed desperation into strategic thinking. But as the hunting party drew closer, Sarah faced a moment of terrible calculation. Her arrows could wound but not kill at this range. Her people carried improvised weapons against men with military rifles. Success would require perfect execution, absolute discipline, and luck that enslaved people rarely enjoyed. Judge Merriweather appeared first, his silver hair gleaming in morning sunlight as he guided his horse between the moss-draped oaks that surrounded the Henderson ruins. His pale blue eyes scanned the abandoned buildings with the methodical attention of a predator who had survived by never underestimating his prey. Behind him, the Hutchins brothers had indeed split to flank the approach, their professional slave-catcher instincts operating exactly as Sarah had predicted. Dr. Webb and Deputy Crenshaw brought up the rear, both men positioning themselves where they could observe without exposing themselves to immediate danger. The hunting party had ridden into Sarah's trap with the confidence of men who had never imagined that their prey might possess military thinking. "Patterson!" Merriweather called, his voice echoing off broken walls. "Report your position!" The silence that answered carried implications that made experienced hunters reach for their weapons. Something had gone wrong with their carefully planned pursuit, and the morning air suddenly felt thick with possibility and threat in equal measure. What would you do, realizing that your assumptions about human nature had led you into mortal danger? How quickly can confidence transform into terror when the powerless reveal they were never powerless at all? Sarah raised her bow as Judge Merriweather's horse stepped into the killing ground, where 12 souls who had chosen freedom over safety prepared to teach their oppressors that some prey bite back. Judge Merriweather's horse shied backward as an arrow embedded itself in the saddle horn inches from his thigh. The morning stillness shattered like glass as 12 voices rose in coordinated war cries that had never been heard on Mississippi soil. This moment would prove that military tactics in the hands of the desperate could topple empires built on human bondage, or it would end with mass executions before noon. The Henderson plantation ruins erupted into controlled chaos as Sarah's carefully positioned fighters revealed themselves with devastating precision. Arrows whistled from the manor's broken windows while improvised spears thrust through gaps in collapsed walls, creating a crossfire that turned the hunting party's numerical advantage into a deadly liability. The air filled with the sharp crack of breaking wood, the metallic ring of weapons striking stone, and the panicked whinnying of horses whose riders had suddenly discovered they were no longer predators. Judge Merriweather fought to control his mount as a second arrow split the air where his head had been moments before. His pale blue eyes, accustomed to the cold calculation of human ownership, now reflected something he had never experienced in 63 years of life: the terror of becoming prey. "Ambush!" Deputy Crenshaw shouted, wheeling his horse toward what he hoped was safety. "They're organized. This isn't random." But retreat was no longer an option. Samuel and his three-person team had circled behind the hunting party exactly as planned, blocking the southern escape route with a barrier of fallen timber and determined fighters. Moses led the western flank, his blacksmith's strength turning improvised weapons into instruments of tactical precision. Above them all, Ruth maintained deadly accuracy from her elevated position, her arrows finding their marks, with the skill of someone who had learned to hunt rabbits to supplement meager slave rations. The professional slave catchers found themselves trapped in a killing field, designed by people they had considered property. From Dr. Webb's medical journal, August 15, 1847, witnessed unprecedented tactical coordination among escaped slaves. Their positioning suggests military training or exceptional natural aptitude for warfare. Tom Hutchins, the more experienced of the two brothers, recognized their predicament with professional clarity. He had spent 15 years tracking runaway slaves across 4 states, but he had never encountered organized resistance that demonstrated strategic thinking rather than desperate flight. This was warfare, not hunting. "Frank," he called to his brother, who was struggling to reload his rifle while arrows whistled around him. "Form up on Merriweather! Defensive circle!" But Sarah had anticipated this response as well. She stepped into full view atop the manor's collapsed front portico, her bow drawn and aimed directly at Judge Merriweather's chest. The morning sun behind her created a silhouette that transformed her from enslaved woman into avenging angel, her voice carrying across the battlefield with absolute authority. "Gentlemen," Sarah called, her tone conversational despite the violence surrounding them. "I suggest you dismount and place your weapons on the ground. Immediately." Merriweather's face flushed purple with rage that exceeded even his fear. "You dare threaten your betters, you ignorant—" Sarah's arrow took his hat clean off his head, the fletching embedding in an oak tree 15 feet behind him. "The next one removes more than your hat, Judge. I've been practicing." Freedom tastes like gunpowder and rebellion. The hunting party found themselves facing an impossible choice: surrender to people they considered subhuman property, or fight against opponents who had demonstrated superior tactical positioning, intimate knowledge of the terrain, and the desperate courage of those who had nothing left to lose. Dr. Webb, his medical training making him acutely aware of mortality, slowly raised his hands. "Perhaps we should consider their offer," he said quietly. "These people clearly possess capabilities we underestimated." But Frank Hutchins, younger and more impulsive than his brother, chose violence over wisdom. He swung his rifle toward Sarah's position, finger finding the trigger with practiced speed. Moses's hammer caught him in the shoulder before he could fire, the blacksmith's throw precise enough to disable without killing. Hutchins toppled from his horse, his weapon clattering across broken stones while his screams echoed off the ruined walls. The message was unmistakable. "Your man needs medical attention," Sarah observed, her bow still trained on Merriweather. "Dr. Webb can provide it. assuming everyone else makes intelligent decisions about their immediate future. The standoff lasted 17 minutes by Merriweather's gold pocket watch, though it felt like hours to men accustomed to wielding absolute power over human lives. Spanish moss swayed in the humid breeze while mockingbirds called from branches that had witnessed the impossible. Enslaved people defeating their masters through superior strategy rather than superior numbers. One by one, the hunting party dismounted and placed their weapons in a pile that glinted with reflected sunlight and broken assumptions. Deputy Crenshaw moved with the careful precision of a man who understood that his authority meant nothing in this reversed world. Tom Hutchins supported his wounded brother while calculating escape routes that no longer existed. Judge Merriweather was the last to surrender, his pale eyes burning with hatred that would fuel nightmares for whatever remained of his life. "This isn't over," he snarled as Ruth collected his pistol. "You think you can murder white men without consequences? The entire state of Mississippi will hunt you down." Sarah studied him with the dispassionate interest of someone examining an insect. "Judge, you seem to misunderstand our situation. We haven't murdered anyone. Yet. What would you do, holding the power of life and death over people who had treated you as livestock? How much mercy would you show to those who had shown you none?" But Sarah's plan required something more complex than simple revenge, and the hunting party was about to discover that their capture was only the beginning of a psychological warfare campaign that would reshape how Mississippi viewed the possibility of slave rebellion. 5 bound men sat in the shadow of their own assumptions, while Sarah circled them like a predator savoring the scent of fear. The rope that had once restrained enslaved bodies now bit into white wrists with poetic precision. What Sarah extracted from these men in the next hour would either provide the intelligence needed to reach freedom, or reveal that escape was impossible and death preferable to recapture. The interior of the Henderson Manor's collapsed dining room still held traces of its former grandeur, though yellow fever and 5 years of abandonment had transformed elegance into decay. Broken crystal crunched underfoot like scattered stars, while wallpaper peeled from water-stained walls in long strips that fluttered like hanged men's tongues. The air tasted of mold and mortality, thick with the humid breath of a Mississippi morning that had witnessed the impossible reversal of power between master and slave. Sarah had positioned her captives in a deliberate arrangement that maximized psychological pressure while minimizing their ability to coordinate resistance. Judge Merriweather sat bound to a chair that had once hosted dinner parties where human beings were bought and sold over brandy and cigars. Deputy Crenshaw found himself tied to the collapsed staircase's newel post, his authority reduced to the helpless rage of a man who had built his identity on violence against the defenseless. The Hutchins brothers occupied opposite corners of the room, professional slave catchers separated to prevent the mutual support that had made them effective hunters. Dr. Webb sat closest to the windows, where morning light illuminated the fierce sweat beading on his scholarly forehead. "Gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing weather rather than life and death. "We need to have an honest conversation about your patrol schedules, communication methods, and the locations of other hunting parties in Warren County." Judge Merriweather's pale blue eyes burned with hatred that had festered for 6 decades of believing in his own racial superiority. "You think torture will loosen white tongues, you ignorant savage? We'll die before betraying our own kind." Sarah smiled with genuine amusement. "Judge, you misunderstand our approach entirely. We're not interested in torture. We're interested in intelligence gathering through educated conversation." From Deputy Crenshaw's official report, filed 3 days later. Subjects demonstrated sophisticated interrogation techniques, suggesting military or professional training far exceeding normal slave education. What followed was not the crude brutality that white men employed against enslaved people, but a masterclass in psychological manipulation that revealed Sarah's true intellectual capabilities. She had spent 11 years studying the weakness and fears of her oppressors, cataloging information with the methodical precision of a military intelligence officer. She knew that Merriweather's eldest son had died in a steamboat accident the previous year, leaving the judge's estate without a clear heir. She knew that Deputy Crenshaw had been embezzling from the county treasury to pay gambling debts in New Orleans. She knew that Tom Hutchins had been wanted for murder in Alabama before relocating to Mississippi under an assumed name. Knowledge was power, and power properly applied could break stronger men than physical torture ever could. "Tom," Sarah said, addressing the elder Hutchins brother with casual familiarity. "How long has it been since you killed that merchant in Mobile? 3 years? 4? I imagine Alabama authorities would be very interested to learn your current location." Hutchins's face went pale as creek-bottom clay. "How could you possibly know?" "The same way I know about the judge's financial difficulties following his son's death," Sarah interrupted smoothly. "The same way I know about Deputy Crenshaw's gambling problems. Enslaved people hear everything and remember everything, Tom. We just rarely have the opportunity to use what we've learned. Truth cuts deeper than steel." The psychological warfare continued for 37 minutes, with Sarah systematically dismantling each man's sense of security by revealing information that proved enslaved people possessed intelligence networks that white society had never imagined. She knew about patrol schedules because she had served dinner to officers who discussed them openly. She knew about communication methods because she had delivered messages between plantations. She knew about hunting party locations because she had been forced to prepare meals for them. Dr. Webb, his medical training making him more observant than the others, began to understand the true scope of what they were facing. "My God," he whispered, "you've been planning this for years." "Closer to a decade," Sarah confirmed. "Ever since I watched my 10-year-old daughter sold to a sugar plantation because Judge Merriweather needed quick cash to cover cotton futures that went bad. That was when I realized that patient intelligence gathering might accomplish what desperate rebellion never could." The revelation hung in the humid air like morning fog, carrying implications that extended far beyond this single confrontation. If one enslaved woman could develop this level of strategic thinking and tactical capability, how many others possessed similar potential? How many kitchens concealed military minds? How many seemingly docile servants were actually intelligence operatives gathering information for future use? Deputy Crenshaw was the first to break, his authority crumbling under the weight of exposed secrets and reversed power dynamics. "What do you want to know?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Sarah's smile held the satisfaction of a chess master achieving checkmate. "Everything, Deputy. Starting with how many other hunting parties are operating in this county today." But as she began extracting the intelligence that would determine whether 12 people lived to see freedom or died as examples to other potential rebels, Sarah faced a calculation that would define her legacy. How much mercy did she owe to men who had shown her none? How much violence was justified in the pursuit of liberty? The morning sun climbed higher, burning off the protective mist that had concealed their ambush, while 12 souls who had chosen war over bondage prepared to discover whether their gamble would lead to Canada or to graves. Deputy Crenshaw's voice cracked like autumn leaves as he revealed the locations of 17 hunting parties scattered across 3 counties. Each word he spoke was another nail in the coffin of white supremacy's illusion of absolute control. The intelligence Sarah extracted in the next 20 minutes would either provide the roadmap to freedom for 12 souls or prove that Mississippi had become an inescapable prison where even the most carefully planned rebellion would end in mass execution. The humid air inside the ruined Henderson Manor grew thick with revelation as Deputy Crenshaw's confession spilled forth like water from a broken dam. His authority, built on decades of casual violence against black bodies, crumbled under the weight of reversed power dynamics that no Mississippi lawman had ever imagined possible. Sweat stained his uniform dark as creek-bottom mud, while his voice trembled with the recognition that everything he had believed about racial hierarchy was collapsing around him. 3 parties operating out of Vicksburg, he whispered, his eyes fixed on the floor rather than meeting Sarah's steady gaze. 2 more from Jackson. Sheriff Morrison's got men watching the river crossings from Natchez to Memphis. Professional bounty hunters working the railroad lines north of Jackson. Sarah absorbed each detail with the methodical precision of a military cartographer, her mind automatically calculating routes, timing, and tactical implications. Moses stood behind Crenshaw, his blacksmith's hands resting on the deputy's shoulders with just enough pressure to remind him that cooperation meant survival while resistance meant something considerably worse. Judge Merriweather watched this exchange with the horrified fascination of a man witnessing his own worldview's execution. "You think this information will save you?" he snarled, though his voice lacked its earlier conviction. "There are hundreds of men hunting runaway property across this state. You'll never reach free territory." Sarah turned her attention to the judge with the patient interest of someone who had been studying him for 11 years. "Your Excellency, you seem to believe we're running away. We're not running anywhere." The words hung in the fetid air like gunpowder smoke. From Tom Hutchins's later testimony to Mississippi authorities, the woman demonstrated tactical knowledge exceeding anything previously observed in escaped slaves. Her questions suggested familiarity with military planning and intelligence gathering techniques. Dr. Webb, his medical training making him more observant than his companions, began to understand the true scope of Sarah's strategy. She wasn't simply extracting information about current threats. She was mapping the entire structure of Mississippi's slave-catching apparatus, identifying weaknesses and coordination failures that could be exploited by future escapes. "How do the hunting parties communicate with each other?" Sarah asked, her tone conversational despite the life-and-death stakes. "Telegraph? Messenger riders? Predetermined meeting points?" Crenshaw's resistance crumbled further under the psychological pressure of prolonged interrogation. "Telegraph for urgent communication. Riders for routine coordination. Weekly meetings at the courthouse in Vicksburg every Saturday morning." Each answer revealed another vulnerability in the system that white Mississippi believed was impregnable. Sarah learned that hunting parties rarely coordinated their search patterns, creating gaps that could be exploited. She discovered that communication delays often lasted hours or even days, providing windows of opportunity for organized groups. Most importantly, she confirmed that the authorities had never encountered coordinated resistance and possessed no tactical doctrine for dealing with escaped slaves who fought back with military precision. Ruth descended from her elevated observation post, her youthful face carrying intelligence that made grown men uncomfortable. "More riders approaching from the east," she reported. 6 men moving fast. They'll be here within 20 minutes. The news created a moment of crystalline clarity that would define everything that followed. Revolution requires sacrifice, not just courage. Sarah faced a decision that would echo through Mississippi history. The approaching riders represented either rescue for her captives or additional intelligence assets for her operation. But engaging another hunting party would escalate beyond simple escape into open warfare against the state's entire apparatus of racial control. "Judge," Sarah said, studying Merriweather's pale features with calculated interest, "who would be leading the relief party? Sheriff Morrison? Colonel Bradley from the state militia?" Merriweather's silence lasted exactly 15 seconds before Dr. Webb answered instead. "Morrison, most likely. He's got standing orders to investigate when hunting parties fail to report." Sarah nodded, her mind processing tactical implications with the speed of someone whose life depended on perfect calculation. Morrison commanded 43 deputies across Warren County, possessed military experience from the Mexican War, and had never lost a fugitive slave to successful escape. He would also provide intelligence about state-level response protocols if properly interrogated. "Moses," Sarah commanded, "prepare our guests for transport. We're moving to the secondary position before Sheriff Morrison arrives." The secondary position was an abandoned iron mine 3 miles northeast of the Henderson plantation, where Sarah had spent 2 years preparing defensive positions that could withstand siege warfare. Underground tunnels connected multiple entrances, creating escape routes that surface forces couldn't block. More importantly, the mine's layout would force any attacking force into choke points where superior numbers meant nothing. But relocating 5 captives while evading an approaching relief force would require split-second timing and absolute discipline from people who had been trained since birth to submit rather than command. Tom Hutchins, his professional slave catcher instincts recognizing the tactical sophistication of their captors, made one final attempt at psychological manipulation. "You realize what you've started here? This isn't just escape anymore. You've declared war on the entire state of Mississippi." Sarah's smile carried the cold satisfaction of someone who had been planning exactly this war for 11 years. "Tom, the war started the day you made us property. We're just finally fighting back with the intelligence you never thought we possessed. What would you do, holding the power to transform individual escape into systematic rebellion? How far would you go to strike at the foundation of an entire economic system built on human bondage?" But as the sound of approaching hoofbeats grew louder, and 12 souls prepared to discover whether their revolution would spread beyond Warren County, Sarah faced the realization that Sheriff Morrison's arrival would force her to choose between remaining a successful escape leader and becoming something far more dangerous to white Mississippi's sense of security. Sheriff Morrison's relief party found 5 bound men and 12 sets of footprints that simply ended at the edge of a limestone cliff, as if their makers had sprouted wings and taken flight. The iron mine tunnels revealed nothing but echoes and the lingering scent of freedom. Sarah's disappearance would either prove that organized slave rebellion was possible, or it would demonstrate that even the most brilliant tactical minds could not overcome Mississippi's determination to preserve human bondage through overwhelming force. The abandoned iron mine shaft plunged 60 feet into Mississippi limestone, its depths black as judgment and twice as final. Morning sunlight barely penetrated the entrance where Sheriff Morrison stood 3 hours later, studying evidence that challenged everything he believed about the intellectual capabilities of enslaved people. Rope burns on his deputies' wrists told one story, while the tactical sophistication of their capture told another entirely. The humid air rising from the mine's depths carried no sound except the distant drip of groundwater and the echo of Morrison's own frustrated breathing. 12 people had simply vanished. The mine's tunnel system extended for miles beneath Warren County, connecting to natural caves that had been carved by underground rivers over thousands of years. Morrison's tracking dogs lost the scent at the mine entrance, their confusion evident as they circled endlessly without finding a trail to follow. Professional slave catchers studied boot prints that led directly to the shaft's edge and simply stopped, as if their makers had learned to fly. "Sir," Deputy Johnson reported, his voice echoing strangely in the limestone chamber, "we've searched every tunnel for half a mile in each direction. No sign of the fugitives or any indication of which route they might have taken." Morrison studied the abandoned equipment left behind by Sarah's group. Rope that had bound his men, improvised weapons crafted with military precision, and most unsettling of all, a hand-drawn map of Warren County that showed hunting party patrol routes with accuracy that suggested months of intelligence gathering. From Sheriff Morrison's official report, August 18, 1847. Subjects demonstrated tactical capabilities exceeding anything previously documented among escaped slave populations. Recommend immediate consultation with state militia regarding potential for organized rebellion. The map revealed the true scope of what Mississippi authorities were facing. Sarah hadn't simply planned a single escape. She had been mapping the entire apparatus of racial control across 3 counties, identifying weaknesses that could be exploited by future rebels. Every patrol route, every communication delay, every gap in coverage had been documented with the methodical precision of a military intelligence operation. But the most disturbing discovery lay in the mine's deepest chamber. 20 feet below ground level, Morrison's search party found evidence of extensive preparation that predated the escape by months or possibly years. Stored supplies, hidden weapons caches, and sleeping areas that could accommodate far more than 12 people. The chamber had been designed as a base of operations for extended guerrilla warfare, not simply a way station for fleeing refugees. The implications sent cold fear through Mississippi's white population. Judge Merriweather, still shaken from his capture and interrogation, provided testimony that would reshape how authorities viewed the threat of slave rebellion. The woman demonstrated knowledge of military tactics, interrogation techniques, and strategic planning that exceeds what most white men possess, he admitted reluctantly. She had been studying us for years, learning our weaknesses, preparing for war. But where had Sarah and her 11 companions actually gone? Legends are born in darkness. The limestone caves beneath Warren County connected to underground rivers that flowed north toward the Yazoo Delta, creating a hidden highway that no surface force could patrol. Local folklore among enslaved communities spoke of ancient routes used by Native Americans, paths that led through underground darkness toward territories where different rules applied. 3 days after the escape, a steamboat captain reported seeing 13 passengers matching the fugitives' descriptions boarding his vessel at a remote landing 50 miles north of Vicksburg. The passengers carried papers identifying them as free blacks traveling to Illinois, documents so expertly forged that they passed detailed inspection. But by the time authorities investigated, the steamboat was beyond Mississippi jurisdiction, and its passengers had vanished into the complex network of northern cities, where former slaves could disappear entirely. Other sightings followed over the next months. A group of black settlers establishing a farm in Michigan Territory, 13 people matching their descriptions working on the Underground Railroad in Ohio. A woman with Sarah's distinctive voice teaching literacy to former slaves in a Canadian settlement. Each report was investigated and found inconclusive, leaving behind only questions and the growing understanding that organized resistance was not only possible, but perhaps inevitable. 6 months later, plantation owners across Mississippi began reporting unusual incidents. Hunting parties that found their horses scattered and their weapons missing. Overseers who discovered elaborate traps along patrol routes. Most disturbing of all, enslaved people who demonstrated tactical knowledge and organizational capabilities that exceeded anything previously observed. Sarah had not simply escaped. She had provided a blueprint for systematic resistance that would echo through the remaining years of slavery. Her tactical manual, copied and distributed through networks that authorities never fully mapped, transformed individual desperation into coordinated rebellion across multiple states. The official investigation concluded that 12 fugitives had drowned while attempting to cross the Yazoo River during their escape. Their bodies were never recovered, officially ending the manhunt while unofficially acknowledging that some mysteries were better left unsolved than fully investigated. What would you do with the knowledge that the powerless had always possessed power, waiting only for the right moment and the right leader to reveal it? How would you sleep knowing that every kitchen might conceal a military mine? Every servant might be an intelligence operative gathering information for future use. The abandoned Henderson plantation stands empty to this day, its ruins overtaken by Mississippi vegetation that seems to grow more aggressively each year, as if the earth itself were trying to bury evidence of what happened there in the summer of 1847. Even now, local residents report strange sounds echoing from the limestone caves beneath Warren County on humid August nights. Voices singing freedom songs in languages that predate slavery, carried on underground winds that blow toward territories where different dreams take root. We're only scratching the surface. The next case is even darker. Subscribe before it drops.